President Trump's tariffs on Canada is one story. Scott Bessent's Iran sanctions, which he calls economic D-Day, are the other one. One story uses access to the American market, the other uses access to the American financial system. Listen, Washington increasingly treats both as weapons for its foreign policy goals. And it's happening while inflation at home is still way above target, and households have already noticed the rising prices of energy, food, and also imported goods. Look, here's the bottom line. Maybe economic pressure can avoid things from getting worse. But in the meantime, who is it that pays while the government applies this pressure? That's the liberty question connecting Canada, Iran, and the American economy tonight. And here to try to suss it out after that long winded introduction is none other than my friend, co host, and Republican vice presidential candidate, Mr. Mike Kermott. Mike, how you doing this week?
Great to be with you, John. As always, I find your openings entertaining. I did not think that that was terribly long-winded, considering all that we have to cover, everything that's been happening this past week. I think that I enjoyed the way you put it together because th- this stuff does present as multiple stories. But I think that these stories all stand on the same platform, and that is that this administration feels a certain way about economic policy. I think that everyone needs to agree that this economic policy is not grounded in what we would consider traditional conservative economic principles. I would go so far as to say that typically, when it comes to economic policy, the administration is just flat wrong and costing the American taxpayer and the American consumer a tremendous amount of value, both in terms of prices currently, but also in the long run in terms of relationships, in terms of economic structure, in terms of financial flexibility, in terms of supply chain control. I think a lot of value is slipping through our fingers, and we need to get to it.
Yeah, Mike, there's so many different aspects to this, and it's interesting because once you start kind of peeling the onion in one area, another onion pops up, and there's more layers to that onion, and then you get a third onion, and there's layers to that onion, and the next thing you know, you've got thousands of layers to go through. Some of them conflicting, some of them not, which is actually something we'll get to later on. But let's talk about perhaps the easiest one to talk about this week, which is the tariffs on that President Trump has put on Canada. After I would assume a couple of weeks of negotiation with Carney, the Prime Minister in Canada, they couldn't resolve their differences when it comes to trade, and President Trump has said they are now invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. And if we notice, these tariff acts are being pulled out of increasingly rare hats, which is a rarely used statute, again, from 1930, which allows the president to impose duties of up to 50% when another country is found to discriminate against U.S. commerce. President Trump is claiming that Canada and its policies involving alcohol, dairy, autos, and auto parts satisfy the standard of Section 338, and therefore he's more than happy to slap the maximum duty on it of a 50% tariff. Canada has said, hey, we're matching it dollar for dollar. Anything you slap on us, we're going to slap the equivalent amount on you. For folks who seem to care about trade deficits. I know you and I don't because it's really meaningless in the larger scheme of things. But for those who follow President Trump's perhaps outdated view of trade, the Canadian US trade deficit is basically even, but the US imports slightly more as a percentage than Canada does of each other's goods. But in whole, it's not one of these. Oh my God, there's an 80% trade imbalance. Again, not that it matters, but if it did matter to you, that's not the case here. So
And it
before
shouldn't. It should not matter to you.
not matter, we've explained this a lot of times. Everyone has a 100% trade deficit with their grocery store. We're not taxing ourselves in order to make that right. But anyway, so before we continue, let's take the lowest
Yeah.
hanging fruit here. Let's talk about the Canadian tariffs,
The,
President. Has
Yeah, the Canadian tariffs are an interesting example. This is disingenuity wrapped in irony and shoved inside of hypocrisy.
okay.
The Canadian situation is coming to the forefront this past month because the U.S. MCA first 6 years is expiring in 1920. In 2020, although that would be funnier if it were 1920. In 2020, President Trump himself, not another U.S. president, President Trump himself signed the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, which was an update to NAFTA. The changes, by the way, from NAFTA to the USMCA were relatively small and correctly should have been labeled as a NAFTA update, should not have been rebranded, but the Trump administration wanted to rebrand it so it looked like they were doing something new. So they updated the trade agreement, and 6 years later, we're supposed to go through a renegotiation, or if nobody complains, if Mexico, Canada, and the United States don't complain, it just rolls into another, I think, 10 years, 16 in total, something like that. uh, goes long term, right? And that's not to say that anyone is forfeiting their sovereignty. If you don't like it, you can scream anytime you want, right? These are not nations that you would expect to go to war with each other. But having said that, the agreement does say that after 6 years, you're supposed to have a look at review and sign up for another period if everyone is happy, or else negotiate. So it expired. It automatically renews unless someone complains. No one officially complained, but we entered into negotiation, and that's all fine. The Canadians say that the Americans are demanding too much, and the Americans are saying that the Canadians are demanding too much. The, and that's where the hypocrisy comes from. But the disingenuity is a product of the Trump administration claiming that we're being discriminated against based on what it is the United States has already agreed to 6 years ago, right? We're complaining that the Canadians are being mean to us by doing what it is that we agreed that they would do.
Not
In the
just,
con-
and it's not something, as you mentioned, that Trump can lay off on Biden because it was Trump himself that agreed to this.
and owned it intentionally,
Right.
right? Claimed that this was a big improvement over NAFTA, blah 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 blah. Now it's one thing to say, it's time to renew, it's time to review, it's time to rethink, and we want better terms. In some sense, you might say, well, the United States is a crappy trading partner, which is another issue we should probably get into. A crappy treaty partner, which is even more important. It's another thing when the United States government says, in effect, you're a bad trading partner. Effectively, you're cheating. And this is going to trigger specific federal law that allows the White House extraordinary powers to react to something extraordinary being done to the American people, which is just an outlandish claim. Not only is it an untrue claim, it's an outlandish claim because even in its complaint, the Trump administration says that part of what it is that they're complaining about is what Canada is doing pursuant to the agreement that we signed in 2020. So, at least for that part, you got to give them props for you're saying the quiet part out loud, right? So that's kind of weird. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, speaking of bad partners, is that we seem to have bumped into this fella, Mark Carney, in Canada, not by coincidence, who likes to push back on Trump as much as Trump likes to push back on other world leaders. Carney is pretty much saying that the president is being a jerk about this. And I say this is not a coincidence because part of the reason Carney was elected is because he was willing to give pushback against President Trump. The Canadians, it turns out, don't like to be treated like second class folks. And I think it's worth mentioning, John, that this is not the way friends treat each other. And that matters because for a nation to sign a treaty with another nation, especially if you're democracies, if this is China and Russia signing an agreement, all bets are off, never mind what I'm about to say. But when democracies sign up a treaty with each other, and it is supposed to have domestic legal authority, it's going to change the way your government does business, right? You need for your elected representatives to sign on. In the case of the United States, you need the Senate to sign off, right? And in Canada, you need the Parliament to sign off. Well, these people are not going to sign off if they think that the government with whom you're signing an agreement is either full of crap or evil. Maybe if they're stupid, that's one thing. But if they're full of it and you can't trust them, then that's a problem. Or if they're just abjectly evil, that's another problem. And I don't know that too many elected representatives on either side of the U.S. Canada border would use that language, but that's the direction in which we're heading, in which both executives are leading the other one to believe, and leading their own people to believe, that you can't trust the other party in negotiation, and they are not negotiating in good faith, that they're stupid, that they're doing the wrong thing by you and the wrong thing by their own people. And then you turn around and ask for your people to support a treaty to be signed. This is not a strategy that works in democracies.
No, it doesn't. And look, to be fair to our administration, it does seem as if Carney is kind of just trying to wait Trump out until the midterm elections. And I think he's very, I don't think it would be out of place for me to say, I think Carney's really just trying to wait him out until the Democrats take over. I think he feels he'll get a better deal from the Democrats if they take over Congress. And again, we find ourselves in this weird juxtaposition. As you said at the top of the show, the Trump administration is not following what would be considered traditional conservative economic policy. They're not conservative on trade. They don't believe in free trade. They don't believe in free markets. Honestly, this is what you would expect protectionist Democrats or socialists or people of that ilk. These would be their economic policies. Ironically enough, these are being implemented and pursued by the Trump administration. And here we have our neighbor to the north, the last nation on the planet you would expect to have beef with. And they're like, we got to hold out till we get the Democrats in charge. And Mike, when you wake up to this some mornings, you're kind of like, am I in one of these parallel universes where things are wacky, because it just doesn't make sense right now.
No, it doesn't make any sense. And part of that is because it's so different from the past. That's why he was elected. That's why President Trump was elected, because he's going to be different from the past. The problem is, this is one of those areas that wasn't broken,
Right.
right? And he's going to smash it anyway. Trade with Canada is one of those things that we had actually gotten right.
Yes.
And with Mexico.
I mean, give credit to President Clinton when NAFTA was passed. Whether it was him or a combination of him and Gingrich at the time. However you want to dish out credit, the point was they got it right. And if you were a conservative or a libertarian in that era, you kind of said to yourself, well, maybe they get everything else wrong, but the one thing we've got it right is
Yeah,
trade.
and it's interesting. You said that the Trump administration doesn't believe in free trade, which of course is absolutely true. But the other thing that really needs to be said, and we don't say out loud often enough, is the Trump administration doesn't believe in trade.
Mm.
Not only do they not believe in free trade,
Right. That's a great point. Yeah.
but they don't really fundamentally, they don't believe in trade. They believe that if you bring manufacturing back to the United States, we'd be better off. That is not only not true, but a real tell in terms of where you're coming from. The only way you can believe that is if you literally don't believe in trade. Or you'd have to build some argument that the stuff that you're manufacturing is, from a defense, a militaristic point of view, something that you had to protect in case you went to war. And the administration is not making that case whatsoever. It's just they don't believe in trade. They think that everything should be made in the United States. And by made, I mean manufactured in the United States, which is, from an economic point of view, a ridiculous a ridiculous assertion. Now, do they believe in free trade? Of course not. Even where they think that trade is a good idea, they think that it should be managed with tariffs, managed with agreements, managed with quotas. This is also a bad idea.
Price controls. We've seen President Trump very, he was talking when, especially when talking about pharmaceuticals. He's like,
Yep.
foreign pharmaceutical companies have to agree to our price structure or else domestic,
Yep.
So that's why, I mean, people think we talk tongue in cheek, Mike, when we say President Trump's economic policy, especially when it comes to trade, is much more aligned with Bernie Sanders than Milton Friedman or Adam Smith or
Much more. And indeed, Sanders and Trump align much more with pre Enlightenment, pre 19th century, pre Adam Smith, pre signing of the Declaration of Independence than with modern, ubiquitous modern thought. There is, no, I hope what I'm about to say is true. Someone fact check me because I hope this is true. This is more hopeful than factual. You can't go to a U.S. university anymore as a freshman, study economics, and get the garbage I did in 19, oh boy, the fall of 1978. That's going back a ways. In 1978, when I had my first course in economics, we were still schlepping out, all that John Maynard Keynes crap about the government spending a lot of money to manage consumption. I hope that no one is still teaching Paul Samuelson's textbook on this crap anymore. And I hope that you cannot learn that managing trade in order to sell as much stuff and collect as much gold as possible, like the 18th century and prior. I hope you can't actually pay tuition to get that crap anymore. And yet, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump believe it to be true.
yes, yeah, and it's you can see that it drives all the decisions from the administration when it comes to how they're going to deal with both adversarial and friendly nations. That's the weird part here. Like if it was somehow just limited to
China.
or Iran, that'll be our next transition point. If this was just limited to Iran, forget China even for the moment, frenemy as it may be. Let's focus on somebody like Iran, somebody we're actually at war with. If you were to focus it on them,
At
you would
least you're having a conversation.
at least you're not nuts. You know what I mean? You might be ill informed, but you're not nuts. To do this with your allies and countries that you're supposedly on very good terms with, whether it's England, Canada, Mexico,
Right, because the idea is that if if you were to have either a worldwide trade war or a hot war, and you needed to be able to manufacture stuff or even run an economy, never mind manufacturing, right? If you just needed to interact and trade, with whom do you want to be doing that? Do you want to limit yourself just to the 50 states, or should it be North America and South America too? I would include, right? Um, I hope the administration would agree that if we end up in a hot war, it won't be with Canada or Mexico, right? So you want to build up your supply chain capabilities, the survivability, the robustness of those chains inside the United States and inside North America, because these are places that you can trust will not be adversaries of the United States in a war. We should be doing everything we can to integrate our economies, not disintegrate our economies, which is exactly where this is going. It's backwards. It's
yeah,
absolutely anti-productive. I don't even want to say counterproductive. It's anti-productive.
it's literally back to the Stone Age in terms of economic policy with the administration, and I just don't think there's any doubt about it now. There's no narrative that could be spun out of the administration that says, constantly being at odds with, at the very least, Canada and Mexico, England, it is productive, or it's more productive and more to the benefit of the United States than what was originally there, which was largely open and unfettered free trade. All right. let's go into what we talked about now. Second one, because there's so much here. I want to see if we could cram it all into one episode, which is,
And again, I think this is the same issue, but go.
yeah, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent basically announced a D-Day against Iran and, perhaps more importantly, anybody that the administration views as aiding Iran. Now, by aiding, we're not that's the key, right? That's the trade, like accepting currency from Iran, facilitating transfer of assets or money,
Buying stuff.
buying stuff in and out of Iran. Scott Bessent and President Trump have decided, hey, that's the same as you bombing Fort Dix. We're just not going to have it. That's all there is to it. And, he called it a D-Day. And perhaps tellingly, uh, Mike, I don't know if you caught this. When one of the pool reporters asked them, like, well, if you're going to have this D-Day, why are you announcing it? Why are you giving them, I mean, if you're in a hot war, you don't announce, at least President
Yeah,
Trump.
as a matter of fact, what the reporter said, Mr. Secretary, D-Day wasn't a threat. It was
Right.
an invasion. Like, it was the real deal. It wasn't, in 6 weeks we're coming.
Yeah, they announced D-Day after the fact, not before the fact, right?
No announcement necessary. Here's 10,000 guys on Omaha Beach.
Right. But here's what Bessent said, which I thought was very interesting. He said, well, why would I blow up the global financial system without giving them a chance not to do that?
Fascinating, John. Let me jump in because I've been dying to say that, and you beat me to it. Anyone watching now should know with certainty. You and I do not discuss this enough in advance. I had planned on delivering that line. You beat me to it. I'm a little bit jealous. To me, this is a huge tell that he knows this is a bad idea.
Right.
He knows. Why would I want to do that?
Right.
Well, it's your policy. What do you mean? Why would I want to do that? We didn't think it was a good idea. You're the one that called the press conference, walked out in front of the damn microphone, and said you were going to do it. Now we say,
Yeah.
do you really mean it? You're going to do it? And you're going to say, why would I want to do that?
Mike, I got it.
Nixon used to have a line. I think I promised someone one time I would never repeat this, but it's too good not to. Richard Nixon once called such a negotiation, do what I say or I'm going to blow my brains out all over your new suit.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. This is Bessent saying, do what I ask or I'm going to do something bad for me and bad for the American public.
It's literally the 5-year-old threatening to hold his breath unless he gets his way. But the thing here I wanted to point out, it's a little bit of a tangent, Mike, but I feel compelled to say it. During the Epstein mess, in the aftermath of the way the administration handled the Epstein files and the way they attacked Massey for passing the law he did, and we saw what happened there. They got him primaried.
Yeah.
J.D. Vance, Vice President.
APAC, yeah.
Yeah. Was doing his podcast tour of all his podcast bros like Joe Rogan and the like, hoping to drum up support again for the midterms. And when this was brought up to him about the Epstein files, he said, look, this quote is seared into my mind. He was on Joe Rogan and he said, look, Joe, you know me. I'm an OG conspiracy theorist. I'll go to my grave saying there was more involved with Epstein than what we're being told. But hey, look, there's nothing there. And I said, what a weird kind of statement. You're the vice president. Like, I expect me and you, Mike, to say, I'll go to my grave, they're covering up something. But if you're the vice president saying, in my bones, I'll go to my grave believing there's something more to this than what's being told. Well, who else are we going to expect to expose this? You're the vice president. There's only one guy above you, right? So the only conclusion I can draw is you really don't want to get to the bottom of it, or the reason you're not getting to the bottom of it is because the one guy who sits on top of you is preventing you from learning about it.
Or you're admitting you're full of crap.
Or you're admitting you're full of crap, right? So there's very limited options.
Either one way or another. Either you don't believe in the idea that there was more there, or you really don't believe that there's not more there.
Right. Either option.
It can both be true.
Yeah. Either option reflects poorly on you if you're J.D. Vance. Same thing with Bessent here. If he says, hey, we're doing this D-Day thing, why are you telling them about it?
Because it's a horrible idea and I hope I don't have to do it.
Right. So what are you really telling us? Are you really telling us that you got on your hands and knees and you begged President Trump not to do this, and he said, "I'm the president, do it anyway," and you don't have the courage to say, "Then I'm resigning, go find someone else to do it," or if you do this nonsense, I'm going to go to public with it to the press, and nobody in the Republican Party will ever hold a public seat again for the next 10 years? Like,
Which
is that
President
what you're
Trump
telling us?
apparently doesn't care too much about, by the way. So not a lot of leverage there.
So what are we talking about when you
Yeah.
and I'm glad you saw it and I saw it, but Mike, let's go a little bit deeper. Why does Bessent think that such an action would blow up the global financial system?
Well, that's interesting because he's right, and it would. Because if you punish everyone who wants to trade with Iran, it means you would have to punish China, right? Otherwise, you just look dumb.
Well, that's the biggie of the bunch that trades
Because
with
it's the
China.
biggie of the bunch. It's the one that buys somewhere between 80% and 90% of Iranian oil. Now, not at the moment, because the United States is blockading the Strait of Hormuz, claiming that Iran is blocking the Strait of Hormuz, which is also true. They're both blocking the Strait of Hormuz. In case, it's like that hotel room connected to the other hotel room. They each have a door blocking, right? And nothing goes between them unless you both unlock the door. Right now, they're both locked. Okay, when the oil is flowing, China buys almost all of whatever it is that Iran has to offer. China's going to go say, pound sand. They're not, they're not having this silliness, right? In which case, if you were to impose the tariff, China's going to tariff you back, and you're off to the same trade war we were into a year ago.
And it's not excuse me, Mike, and I'm going to jump in a lot because I love talking about this stuff. It's not just tariffs. And it's not just China. Russia's a player in this as well, right? And India.
Because Russia
So
and
when
India are big trade partners with Iran.
yeah, it's the BRICS. It's the BRICS
Right. So you
alignment.
basically bifurcate the world into people who are going to, who do trade with Iran. And now you're going to say, well, if you trade with Iran, you can't trade with us. I mean, if you want to, you can, but we're going to put this huge tariff on. So eventually we're going to bifurcate into two piles. The Iranian segment, the American segment. The Iranian segment is going to include China and Russia and a bunch of others. And then, we'll have the Western half. The problem is that we can't live, neither can China, by the way, live without each other.
And it's not just tariffs, right? It's access to the financial system that the US controls through its position as owning the world's reserve currency. So think about it like this. It's not just like we're going to put an extra 50 or 100% on Chinese goods, the typical tariff nonsense that Trump does. We're talking about you can't access your dollars. You can't get in and out of the banking system. You can't use Swift. You can't use the transfer of money. And that is more important than like a tax, which is what a tariff
Yeah.
is, right? So that to me is the real nuclear
Pinch.
bomb here, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's the
that's the pinch. That's a big pinch. Not the only pinch, but it's a big pinch. And in the long run, what you're saying is you better develop your own capabilities to live without us.
and very interestingly enough, Mike,
They
they are.
will. Yeah,
They already are. I would argue that
they're on their way.
Russia has already started to develop its own stable coin
Yep.
for national purposes.
Yep.
Um, Crypto obviously is starting to take off, and our old friend gold. You and I were just discussing before the camera turned on. Central banks have been buying gold. Every central bank except the U.S. has been steadily increasing its acquisition of its stockpile of gold reserves for the last 3-4 years. Basically, since President Trump took office the first time, been saying we're not buying treasuries, we're buying gold. So talk to me about that
This
as well.
is a crisis of confidence, as most crises are. Central banks are in the business of getting people to trust them. That's the core business they're in, right? Maybe they issue currency, or at the very least they control currencies for their nation. Or if you already screwed it up in decades past, you're in the business of trading with other people's currencies, right? But one way or another, you're in the business of earning and maintaining the trust of the people in your underlying economy. That's your job.
Right. Now,
That's
now,
your job.
you're right. And let me just interject for folks that may not be as savvy in this. Confidence in a large degree is reflected by interest rates on your treasury yields, right? So when someone says the 30-year US Treasury or the 10-year US Treasury pays more, and right now we're at 20-year highs, right? When you hear they're paying more, people say, well, what's wrong with more interest? I get more interest on my bond. I get 5%. Well, that's because it the bonds are not selling. People don't want to buy them. So the government has
Investors are demanding that they get paid more interest to hold your debt because they don't trust you.
right. So it's inverse. If you have higher confidence in the central bank, you get lower interest rates. The higher the interest rates go, the lower the confidence that's
That's
had in
exactly
that
right.
central bank. So they
And
work
so you've got,
opposite, right?
yep. So you've got treasury departments around the world that are trying to maintain credibility and earn the trust of their investors who lend them money. And then you've got central banks that are in the business of similarly earning and maintaining the faith, the trust, the confidence of people that hold their currency. Well, what does it say when the person trying to earn your faith and trust and confidence in your currency is secretly demonstrating that they don't trust the value of their own currency? Like, you people hold, I'm in the business of issuing euros. You people should trust my euros. I'm going to take care of them. I'm not going to cause too much inflation. I'm not going to have stupid rules. I'm not going to have stupid exchange rules. I'm not going to exclude people. You can trust me. Hold euros. Buy my euros. Trust my euros. I'm buying gold. But you should hold euros. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to buy gold. But you should hold euros. And all the other central banks around the world are similarly positioning themselves. They're not saying out loud that they're accumulating gold. I mean, they have to disclose, right? But they're not saying this as a point of pride. They're not saying we're accumulating gold in case it hits the fan because we don't trust our own future, while simultaneously saying you can trust us, right? So when these institutions, above all, are the ones who signal we're in the trust game and we don't trust our ability to maintain that trust without trusting in something besides us, and so we're accumulating gold, you want to listen to them. They are telling you what the problem is, that there is something amiss, that there is something that can't be trusted. And what Bessent is in effect saying is that it's me. Why would I want to do? He's not saying, why would China want to take us on? Why would Iran want to take us on? Why would Canada want to take us on? Why would Mexico, why, blah, blah, blah. No, why would I want to do that? He is telling us, whether he means to or not, who the problem is. It's him, it's the administration. This administration is positioning itself on the precipice of destroying the world trade system. The Treasury Secretary of the United States government just said so. This isn't you and me reading between the lines. These are not tea leaves. This is just listening to the guy on CNN, right? He just goes in front of a microphone and says, I'm about to destroy the world economic system. Why would I want to do that? I don't know, boss. Maybe you should back away from the microphone, right?
Yeah, I don't think most Americans realize, because if they did, you would see nothing but a blue wave in November. No matter,
And
you
you're
know what
you're
I mean?
absolutely right. And I know this is actually what you want to talk about. And what you would see is fewer investors wanting to buy US Treasury bonds,
Absolutely. Which we're seeing already, by the
which
way.
we're seeing already.
Right.
So Again, this isn't like projecting the future. This is looking back on last Friday.
Right.
It would be one thing if this was, two old guys who used to be in banking doing a podcast and prognosticating, "Oh, what do you gee, John, I don't know, Mike, what do you think? I don't know. In the future, we may have well, that could happen, but that seems no, that's not what this is about. Last week,
Right.
the Treasury Department had a hard time selling the bonds it wanted to sell at a good rate, and so it went into the market itself and bought its own securities.
Right, and they'll tell you it wasn't quantitative easing for the nerds out there, right? Like, if you ask Bethman and say, "Did we just have a round of QE? Did we have a round of quantitative easing?" He'd say, "Right." So here's and technically he's right. They didn't print dollars to buy treasury bonds. What they did was they they took their short-term bonds and essentially traded them in for the longer yield, the 10 and the 30 yield bonds, right?
You say potato.
It's the same nonsense, basically. But the most important and striking thing here is Bessent did that with the hope of knocking it's called yield curve management, right? The government wants to take the yields that are out 10 and 30 years, the long what's known as the long end of the curve,
Where
and
interest rates are getting higher because people don't trust the United States for 30 years.
it hit a high of 5.33%, the
And
yield,
by a high, we mean highest in 2 decades.
20 years. And again, remember the relationship. The higher the yield, the less confidence others have in your treasury. So it hit the high, and Besson said anything over that, and for those again in economics is a little nerdy, once it crosses 5%, that's a warning signal. It means
Of course it
think
is.
it's bad, recession is coming, inflation, the whole 9 yards.
I
So
mean,
he
someone doesn't trust you. Either they don't trust your ability to control inflation, which is the usual thing people worry about, or, and this is what makes you so upset and me, what they don't trust now is even whether they can get paid back in 30 years.
right, it's now not just a rate risk, it's a credit risk as well. So Besson said, "I gotta do something." Now he goes in and he buy again, they do this sleight of hand with the duration. He knocks it down to about 4
Borrow short, buy long. Yeah.
right, knocks it down under 5%, and he's like, "See? Thumbs up." My my training with George Soros, which a lot of Republicans don't want to admit, uh, my training with Soros worked, boss. I got it under 5%. That lasted all of 24 hours. When the next auction hit, 0 demand essentially for US long bonds. Those rates went back up to where they were.
Of course,
20
because the market recognizes when there's silliness temporarily holding down the interest rate.
you're an old hand at this, and so am I. In less than 24 hours, it reverted. Isn't did that suddenness strike you? Because, like, I mean, we're talking about a large market, right? For it to have that momentous a swing in both directions in 24 hours is quite stunning, isn't it?
It is, and what it suggests is that what we should have been surprised about was not that so much, as it turns out, as we should have been impressed by Bessent's ability to swing one day's worth. Good for him for being the guy who was able to sell all of his junk on one day with the money that he availed himself by borrowing short. Good for him. Good for him. He was able to save a little bit of money one day. Okay, shorty, I'll give you one day. Good for you. Good for you. Good for you. You got it right for one day. Okay. What are we gonna do the next 25 years?
And what's interesting, Mike, is after that unexpected bounce back, I guess, or maybe look, Besson is a smart guy. You and I may think he's not doing the right thing or being sneaky or whatever, but I don't think anyone would accuse him of being an idiot.
He's
So
not an idiot, but he must have been surprised, or else he wouldn't have done. I wouldn't think that he would have gone into the market for only one day's worth of success. I think he must have had someone in the Treasury Department who, and look, the Treasury, I don't know if you've ever met these guys, Just a quick diversion,
Sure.
because I have had the pleasure. If you have never met the economists who manage debt in the bowels of the Treasury Department, I mean, there is a floor with no windows. These guys are beneath that. Okay.
It's like some weird anti-casino.
Yes. 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 It's you've heard, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Yeah,
Okay. What goes to the bowels of the Treasury Department stays in the bowels of the Treasury Department.
right,
These guys make nerds look like Vegas. All right. These guys are not known for their creativity.
right.
These are guys who read Robert Barrow's treatise on what happens to the value of treasuries when they're managed and when rates go up and when rates go down, and it's detailed stuff. These are not guys who are given to, oh boy, boss, yeah, why don't you go into the market with a couple $100 billion and control interest rates for a few hours? That should work. Yeah, 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 yeah. Let's try that. Skippy says it's a good idea. No, there is no way that civil servants would have green-lighted such silliness, even if it would have worked, even if it was brilliance, it was outside the box. There's no way civil servants would have suggested it. And
No, no.
what it means to me is that Scott has surrounded himself with politicos and friends who are willing to tell him to go ahead and try something that was doomed.
Well, let's face it. The guys you described at Treasury, inside joke for economists, are the guys who would read like Schumpeter and find that to be light reading. And for anybody who's read Schumpeter's treatise on capitalism or anything else, they're dense, written in typical Austrian German prose, like one sentence may go on for 4 pages, no punctuation, right?
Right.
Those kind of nerds are not the Scott Bessent nerds. And I'm not, that doesn't mean,
That's exactly right.
right? Scott Bessent, for those that don't know, in one day made $1 billion betting against the government of England, the central bank of England. That's how he made his bones. And for those that don't even know that, that's how George Soros made his bones, right? Like just manipulating currencies and government.
So you're talking about a smart guy who's creative and believes in his ability to move markets, control markets, participate in markets, watch how they go, make money off of it. That's his thing.
And by the way, not feel bad about any of it. I think that's another key component for these currency guys. I worked in the FX markets, Mike, just, like you worked at Treasury. Those guys, while they never broke the law as far as I could see, they had no problem saying the result of my trade might put 60% of homeowners out of their homes. They would have, they'd be like,
Right.
everyone signed a deal on their own accord. That's the mentality guys like Bessent come from. They're brilliant, but they're not worried about grandma on Main Street. Despite what
Right.
President Trump, I'll give him this. President Trump is probably more worried about Main Street homeowners than Scott Bessent ever will be or
That
ever.
may well be. And the other thing that needs to be said is that Scott lacks an appreciation for his inability to control markets. And so when it snapped back the next day to what it was always going to snap back to, and apparently surprised him, I hope he learned his lesson.
Well, the thing is, did he? Because when he was running his hedge fund, he didn't care about the next day. He made his profit today, probably took his profit and moved on to the next thing.
Sure, but remember his motivation was presumably to keep rates down in the long end and didn't do it.
He didn't do it. So now we're
I
left.
don't know. So anyway, now we have, you did bring up the quote, good for you. So now we have this situation where he's admitted that he doesn't want to do this.
Right.
My guess, my theory, my working theory, and many of my working theories are wrong, so take this with a grain of salt. But my working theory is that what we're actually getting ready for in now 29 days is Xi coming to Trump, Washington summit, the leader of the Chinese government, leader of the American government, going to sit down and have a discussion. I think the White House is setting, the administration is setting this up for, Xi and Trump being able to announce, oh, we like each other, we've come to terms, we understand each other, and we have a deal. We're not going to impose these tariffs. And Bessent probably shouldn't have said the quiet part out loud, which is this is a stupid idea and I'm not going to impose it anyway, because he's ruining the surprise, right? He spoiled Trump's big reveal when Xi is here, which is we're not going to impose the tariffs. That's my guess, is that that's where this is going. We're going to kick the can down the road for another 4 weeks. We have an announcement, and we save world trade. We save the world. We save the world economy from our own stupidity, because Trump will brilliantly pull a rabbit out of a hat at the last minute. But having said that, it undermines this whole silly idea. We haven't even gotten to whether the tariffs are a good idea or not. We,
Well, I think we've kind of established they're not, but
in their objective, this whole silly idea that they even could work.
yeah,
You would have to believe that the economic thrashing that we have given Iran for literally decades, that was not enough. But this is going to do it, right? This is going to be the straw. Maybe it's heavier. Maybe this is going to be the 4x4 that finally breaks the camel's back. And I just don't believe it. I don't think the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps cares one bit about the population. If they did, they wouldn't have killed 10, 20, 30,000 of their own people for protesting.
right.
They certainly don't care about the economy of their nation.
Mike, you and I talked about this at the outset of the Iran war. Um, Back when it started, I honestly thought it would drag at least through the midterms. Turns out that I'm probably going to be right, unfortunately, about that. The other thing is, President Trump, in a bit of frustration last week, said, I don't even know who I'm dealing with over there. I don't know who to negotiate with, as if it's not of his own doing. Like a lot of what they seem to be frustrated about, Trump, Bessent, Vance, is of their own doing. Like, hey, the strait is closed. Well, you did that. It's like,
Right. And any college kid in foreign affairs could have told you that the government of Iran had multiple parts. They're always, hard to keep track of who's in charge of what. But the foundation is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And if they don't like it, the mullahs aren't signing it.
right. And they're not particularly a government that values human life either. So,
Or
when,
economics.
or economics. So when you put it all together, I think you and I may have said it around May. Iran already had won the war back then, right? Like there's no scenario once May hit, once that first ceasefire deadline went without any severe or real progress. Iran won the war at that moment. They're
Yep.
winning the war now.
Yep.
Whenever the actual hot war ends, there is no scenario where you say the U.S. won. Zero scenario. There, like even if we ended up nuking them, which would be horrible and unthinkable, you couldn't say the U.S. won, and that's
Not in the sense of putting ourselves in a better place than we were. That's right. The only way, to back up what you're saying, the only way you could claim victory is if you were to say, well, the Iranian government presented a huge nuclear risk and now it doesn't.
even that would be like I think stretching it. I think the only way you could declare victory in Iran is if all of a sudden it was opposite day and everything just meant the opposite. So when you declared victory, you were declaring defeat. That's the only way it would work because right now the American taxpayer has paid dearly for this through inflation. Um, the debt now is at over $40 trillion. Like you can't put this on Biden if you're Trump. You can't say this is Biden's inflation. The one big beautiful bill has made things worse, not better. Trade stinks. So nothing good has come out of this. Zero that
Yep.
anyone can see.
Yep.
So, and the last thing I want to talk to you about, because we are talking about inflation in the economy, here's a leg a lot of people aren't talking about. Kevin Warsh, the new Fed chairman, when he was confirmed and nominated and took Powell's place at the head of the Fed, you said to me, you said, I think Kevin Warsh is probably the best person we could hope for, given all the circumstances, and in general, he's the best person we could have hoped for to take that spot. I was a little 50-50 on it. You said he's the best guy we had. And it turns out, Mike, that so far, if he's not an aggressive inflation hawk, he's at least someone who isn't kowtowing to the president's desires, which would be to lower interest rates. He has kept them essentially steady.
Yep.
And from what the governors seem to be
Yep.
voting, again, he's cut down the guidance. It seems like we might get a slight increase in rates. We're certainly not getting a decrease in rates anytime soon.
Yep.
Now,
He's the right guy.
he's the right guy. I agree with his decisions, by the way.
Yep.
I would have liked to see a little bit of a interest rate hike to cool off inflation some more, but
Yep. Yep. Yep.
yeah,
Yep. Yep.
fair
Yep.
enough. Does it strike you as a loony bin or an asylum in Washington when the Treasury Secretary is pursuing his policies, economic D-days, inflationary policies, and the head of the Fed is doing the opposite? He seems to be laser focused on, I got to get inflation down to my target of 2%. That's our main thing here. We have to keep an eye on unemployment. We have to keep an eye on inflation.
Yep.
And to a layman like myself, the right hand is doing one thing, the left hand is doing the
I
complete.
think if you're Bessent, you're counting your lucky stars that you don't have an idiot at the Fed.
Do you think he's aware of that, or do you think
Yeah,
he doesn't care?
I think he's aware of it. And I
Okay.
think that if Warsh were inflationary,
Mm.
that
He'd be
would make it harder for Bessent to be threatening tariffs during an election year.
so, again, just for the folks so they're not confused, if by you saying if Warsh, the head of the Fed, was inflationary, by that you mean he would be cutting interest rates, making it easier to borrow money and
If
therefore
he were allowing inflation to creep up,
to creep up, yeah.
then there would be extra pressure on Bessent not to do anything that would also allow prices to creep up.
Do you
In
view
other
it
words,
as a
it'd be
balance act right now between those 2 guys? Do you view it as a balance? In other words, do you think Bessent and Warsh are coordinating their
no,
strategies at all?
I don't think so. I don't think you have to. I think all you have to do is trust that Warsh is going to do the right thing.
What
And
kind
I think that Warsh is much less influenceable. He's supposed to be zero influenceable. I don't even know if influenceable is a word, but he's supposed to be beyond reproach when it comes to the government being able to influence him. He promised he would be, and he's kept his promise. He has not allowed inflation to increase much. I mean, it has a little bit, but for a lot of other reasons, mostly because of tariffs and other stupid things going on, the war, right, and energy prices. That's what's been driving inflation, not monetary policy at the Fed. So, from the Treasury Department's point of view, all they have to do is let Warsh do the right thing, create the environment in which they could impose tariffs and believe, or at least allow others to believe, that they could get away with it politically. Whether they could or not is almost secondary. All they need is for foreign governments to believe that we believe it. In other words, how you and I always say it's amazing how the Iranian government doesn't care about its own people.
Right.
Bessent is trying to do the same thing. Bessent is trying to convince Mark Carney in Canada that we're willing to impose tariffs, so little do we care about our own people. And to make that a credible threat, you have to be operating in an environment with very low inflation. Unfortunately, it's not low enough to make that threat. But if Warsh were allowing more inflation, it would be very difficult for Bessent to make that claim. In effect, he hasn't said so out loud, but in effect, that's what Bessent and Trump are saying, is that it's credible that we might impose these tariffs, and the American people are going to hang in there with us through the election because we otherwise have low inflation. We're bringing the war to a close, which is not true. But we're going to impose these tariffs, which are going to help us bring this war to a close, bring energy prices down, and everyone's going to be happy and vote for Republicans.
Do you think that Warsh is gonna be able to hold the line?
Yeah, I do. And that's because he has a lot of support inside the Fed. Remember that the Fed, as an institution, is dominated by relatively conservative economists, not uniformly. There's a few dinglings in there, but they don't outnumber the grown-ups. Warsh is a grown-up. He is sensitive to the opinions of grown-ups.
Yeah, and look, tellingly, Powell is still a governor. So the former federal Fed chief is one of the voting body of governors.
Absolutely, and has as many votes as the chair,
Right.
which
But
is to say one.
which more importantly, he's still got Powell buzzing in his ear, meaning Warsh. So
Yeah,
let's you know
he
that.
does, and no one has alleged, and I don't think anyone's going to allege in a leak to the press that those two guys are at each other's throats, because I don't think they are. I think they're on the same page. And what the only part we don't know is when they have lunch together, do they say, "Boy, that White House sure is something, huh?" And does the other guy say, "Yeah, that's a great thing," or does he say, "Yeah, that sucks"? We don't know, but we do know that these two guys are conservatives who don't want a lot of inflation.
Well, Mike, just to sort of wrap things up, then why do you think the president was snookered in nominating Warsh, or do
Yes.
you think someone maybe was working against the president by knowing that Warsh was a hawk, kind of said, "Oh, this Warsh guy will lower rates, boss. You should put him up," knowing that Warsh wouldn't, to sort of
Oh,
inject.
yeah, I don't know. But was the president snookered? No, absolutely the president was snookered. We don't know how, right? Because there's five different ways that could have happened, right? A staffer could have lied to him. Warsh could have lied to him. He could have he could have fooled himself because he just, didn't understand, um, or just circumstances, right? But however it happened, was the president snookered? I think I'm going to say 80-20. The president was probably full of a different expectation, and that he's only giving it a certain amount of time until he starts complaining because it's still too fresh. He would have to admit he made a mistake, and that's not in his wheelhouse. So he's got to give Warsh some time, and I think Warsh correctly understands that, and he's not going to squander it. But will there come a time when the president complains? Absolutely. Look. The president felt snookered by. Uh, well, I was going to say Janine Pirro.
Oh, right, right, yes,
I
yeah,
mean, this does happen. The president feels snookered from time to time when people decide to be professionals.
yeah. Pirro's another interesting case. Maybe we don't have time to talk about it, but I would argue so much as to say he wasn't snookered by Pirro. It's just that Pirro just couldn't go against all those judges and grand juries who were not indicting.
Exactly. He got snookered because he thought she would. He thought she was going to be an idiot.
Okay. All right, Mike. I think that's a great point to end the show on. Lots of interesting stuff, and by all means, folks, if you're watching this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Please feel free if you think Mike or I said something out of line or you like what we said, leave it in the comments wherever you're watching this. We will get back to you. But Mike, on top of that, special event coming up in your quest to become the vice presidential candidate nominee for the Republican Party. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about that?
We got a breakfast in Dallas. That's it. We got a breakfast in Dallas, September 10 from 8 to 10. If you're a delegate or a member of the media, and you're going to be in Dallas for the convention, the Trumpapalooza. I actually haven't figured out how to pronounce it. Is it Trumpalooza or Trumpapalooza? How many syllables? But anyway, we have
Trumpapalooza. Trumpapalooza, I think. Yeah.
Trumpapalooza.
We would put a papa in there. Yeah.
I think it's a Trumpapalooza.
Okay.
Anyway, the Republicans are getting together. It's not a convention in the traditional sense of conventioneers and delegates voting on things.
Not a nominating convention.
It's not a nominating convention, and they're not going to take up the platform and rules about the convention, rules about the party, rules about policy or conduct. It's not like that. This is mostly a fundraiser. It's a rah rah. It's going to be a lot of fun, I hope, and because I'm going. Um, and anyway, the Republican Liberty Caucus of Texas, the Republican Liberty Caucus of Texas is sponsoring a breakfast on September 10 for delegates. It's free. So if you're a delegate, if you're out there and you can hear my voice and you're a delegate and would like free breakfast on September 10, which is Thursday. Now, Milton Friedman told you there's no such thing as a free lunch, but there is such thing as a free breakfast, except you're going to have to put up with me walking around, shaking hands, and passing out business cards, which is a fairly small price to pay. Maybe it's not free, but a fairly small price to pay. And my friends from the Republican Liberty Caucus of Texas, I personally am from the Republican Liberty Caucus of Virginia, but my friends from the Republican Liberty Caucus of Texas will also be there, and we will talk to you only briefly. We're not going to interrupt your breakfast very much, only briefly about the RLC and talk about what's going on. It's a great group, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So it's at a Mexican restaurant. Reach out to me, Mike at MikeTremont.com. I'll set you up.
Fantastic. If you're in the area on September 10th, drop by, have a conversation with Mike. This sort of fun conversation shouldn't be just limited to me and Mike over a video. So if you're in Texas, go ahead and join that Republican Liberty Caucus sponsored event. I'm sure everyone there will enjoy themselves thoroughly. Until next time, when we do this again, for my co-host Mike Termott, this is Big John. Peace, everyone.